You know, there's a certain point that when you're messing with triggers, that's the best way to really talk about this, is you stop feeling really the metal and you feel more of the springs. Well, that's when it gets good. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nobody, and we are at the Untrained Unprofessional Workbench, working on the Ruger RXM. Now, for a $400 pistol, it feels pretty decent. Does it feel as good as it could be? No. It can be a lot better. And there are some simple things that you can do to get it there. Now, after my initial review, I kind of wanted to start playing with the engagement surfaces and getting them kind of polished up. So I took a Grater wheel and just kind of buffed everything up, followed up with a little bit of felt and polishing compound, and then took it back out to the range. Now, I will say that even though I did all that, it didn't turn out as well as I thought it could. So I came back to the bench and did a little bit more work. I had some issues with brass shavings, and honestly, this felt like it had a little bit of a stutter at times when it was feeding, especially when it had a full magazine. So I really wanted to look at it and see how I could eliminate those steps. So the next thing that we need to take care of on this is figuring out where all these little brass shavings are coming from. And usually there are a couple of culprits. One, which is the most obvious, is where it goes right over the magazine. So this will just take care of it by doing some polishing and making sure that there are no sharp edges where it makes this transition, especially right here. Ultimately, is this something that you have to go to this length? No, not really. But if you want to increase the ease of cycling and lessen the friction that's on the system, it's not bad. It doesn't take too long, and it's kind of fun. I like doing this type of stuff. This corner has a tendency of, when a round comes up, if it comes up just slightly off center, what it'll do is, as it's pushing up, it will grab onto the sharp 90 and shave a little bit. So that kind of slows down the operation of everything, and also increases your little brass shavings throughout the slide. And they get everywhere. But you can see a good one right here in the grease. Okay, so next we're going to go ahead and take care of where it is shaving the brass on the case rim when it comes up, which, as you recall, is this area right here. And how we're going to do that is with a punch. Now what you want to do is get at about a 45-degree angle onto that corner, and you're just going to pop it. And let's go ahead and take a look. Yeah, there we go. That is already at a nice little angle. So hopefully you can see that little chamfer that I just used that punch to create, and that will keep it from shaving off brass. Now you might be wondering about the other side. Yeah, there's a sharp corner right there. The only bad thing is that this little area right here is very thin, and I'm afraid of bending it too much because you have all this mass behind where I did that first corner. I don't have that here. So that, if you're worried about it, just take a file with a safe edge to go against right here and just knock that off. It's hard. The last area that I'm going to work on is on the barrel, and it's going to be right here at the top of the feed ramp, where you can see that they went ahead and at the factory did a little bevel around the chamber, but it is not enough. Right here at the top of the feed ramp, there's a little brass smile to where the case is rubbing, and that is slowing down the slide velocity, which is never a good thing. And as you remember, I was having some stuttering as the rounds were going into the chamber. So we're going to go ahead and relax that a little bit and then polish it. So my goal here is going to be as minimally invasive. So my goal here is going to be as minimally as invasive as I possibly can. I just want to kind of kiss this a little bit very lightly and round over where it's going to want to come in, and then I'll polish. So now I'm going to go through the different Cratex bits and just really hyper polish that and blend it into the feed ramp. And then I'll probably also run them inside of the chamber as well, especially up at the top of the chamber where the round is coming up, hitting, and then straightening out. So I went ahead and polished it up off a camera, and it's not total mirror, but it's pretty darn shiny. And what's more important is it's a nice smooth transition. I'm not feeling anything catch as the round is going into the chamber. Feels really good. I'm happy with it. And I could have gone a little bit shallower of an angle on that transition, but I want to see if this will work for me, because I can always take off more. I can't put any back. Okay, the next area I'm going to look at is this locking block unit. And the reason why I'm looking at this is because this is where the guide rod goes in. And as you can tell, that it is kind of a tight little fit right there. And it's not an issue, I'm not getting any problems from it, but I just want to make this cycle smoother. Now, as you can see, that there is a witness mark where that spring has been rubbing right here on the locking block. And that is rubbing because, as you can see, the spring is already doing an undulation. And as it is being compressed back, it is binding up onto the side of the block. So that's just what is happening. So it's creating a little bit of friction. So I want to polish where that is going, so that way it happens nice and smooth. But the other thing about that undulation is that it is actually hitting on the corner, and it's leaving little a bright shiny spot, you know, against the matte finish of this block. So I'm going to put a little bit of bevel right there to help it channel and not get caught up, because I don't know if this is also part of the hesitation in the chambering, you know, the little hiccup that I was experiencing, but I just want to eliminate it as a problem. For removal, I'm just going to use a file. Put a little chamfer just like that. I'll do that to the other side, and this is when I wish I was left-handed. You ever try to do something the opposite and you just feel slightly retarded? I'm just going to sand those smooth. Yep, that feels fine. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take the same 240 grit and hit the inside. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that this might just be a little excessive, but to me it's worth it because it's a lot of fun to do, and I just want to see what things I can do to this to make it run better. And hence I'm sharing it with you. So the hard thing about this video is going to be that I've already done some work beforehand, and I'm going to splice in some of the footage there, but also bring you up to date with new things that I have done. Now, I've already hit all these areas that are going to rub up against each other with the Kratex bit and a felt polishing wheel, and it didn't get me to where I wanted to be. It was better, but I was still getting areas that were scratching on the inside of the fire control insert, and it just didn't feel as nice as I knew it should feel. So I came back to the bench and I took an Arkansas stone. Well, actually, before I took an Arkansas stone, I took an India stone, and I just went ahead and just kind of deburred, any of these edges to where metal might catch on it. And I did that for the insert and on the trigger bar. I also did that on the connector, which this connector, this is actually a Ghost 3.5 pound, which we'll get to this a little bit later, but the 3.5 pound, whoo, that helped. So that's a good one. You don't have to get the rocket. I just had one lying around. But anyway, so I took my Arkansas stone with some honing oil. This side is where your slide release is. I went ahead and kind of knocked down these edges really quick, and just to help with reliability. But I spent a decent amount of time working the inside edge of where the trigger bar actually goes back and forth, hitting all these areas. I wanted it to be nice and smooth and flat. But the real work ended up being on the trigger bar itself. This engagement area, which I don't know the best way to describe this to you guys. If you never used an Arkansas stone before, when you're working the metal, if there is something wrong, it imparts a feel into the stone and into your fingertips that tells you that it doesn't feel right. And so it's a great guide of where you need to work and for how long you need to work. My biggest area that had a problem was just right up here towards the, I guess you should say, the back of the trigger bow, and took an extra 20-30 seconds to do, but it improved the feel of the trigger immensely. The other areas that I hit, this is your firing pin safety tab. This deactivates that little plunger. I used the stone to take off any potential sharp corners. That way I reduced the amount of drag that was going on. On the back of the trigger bar, this area right here, which is going to be on the right side, rubs up against the fire control insert right here. And then also on the inside underneath the cruciform, where it rubs up against the connector. Went ahead and made sure that there were no sharp edges or burrs. Now, one of the relationships in the whole trigger system that I try to spend a decent amount of time on is the connector and the trigger bar, where they interface. There are several different little problem areas that could be happening with this relationship that affect how your trigger feels. And it's all because this is stamped metal, you got 90-degree corners, and you have radius bends. Now when you look at your connector, now granted this is not your connector, this is your connector. I have a 3.5 pound rocket connector, so ignore the fact that it looks different. But this bent piece of metal right here is bent into basically a 90 degrees, but the metal does not bend to a perfect 90. It bends into a radius. This radius becomes a problem because the sides of this radius are not beveled to match this. It is a sharp corner. So you have a sharp corner digging into your radius. And if you know anything about pinpoint pressure, if you take 100 pounds of pressure and push down in an area of a dime, you're going to feel that more versus if you took 100 pounds of pressure and you spread it out over a couple of feet. It will feel like it is less pressure. So we need to reduce the amount of pressure that is going on in that corner. Now what I like to do is take the inside of my trigger bar, and on this corner alone, take a small stone like this little diamond stone here, and I take off that 90-degree corner. And I keep working that, putting it back into the fire control insert, try the trigger to see how it feels. And at a certain point, you'll know when it is correct, because it's all about the feel of what the system is imparting back to you. Now on the connector itself, you have this bent piece of metal here. Now whenever you bend metal, it upsets metal as well, and that upset metal is going to go wherever it needs to go. So what I like to do is take some type of stone, run it across the connector, trying to deburr any of that upset metal. And I need a pointer. I try to make sure that I take off anything that can occur here on this corner right here. I always check this back corner, even though it may not interfere as much, but definitely up here. And then I like to make sure that this whole area, as this is a stamped part, has nothing that can drag up against that trigger bar. So deburr everything, get it nice and flat, hit it with a stone, polish it, make it gorgeous. So I'm just going to hit the top of the firing pin here just to give it a nice little polish, but I'll also hit the sides of the firing pin and the front where it goes over the sear. Again, trying really hard not to change that sharp little angle, but anywhere that this will rub up against on the slide in the firing pin channel, I'm going to go ahead and give it a polish. So my plan was to leave the sear alone, but when I was working on the firing pin, I don't know if you guys can see the little witness mark. It had a very sharp little burr on the sear. And so I took my Arkansas stone and I basically very gently worked that corner until that little burr went away and I no longer have that burr. So it might be something you have to do, might not. Your part is going to tell you what needs to happen or where any potential issues are. Let's talk about springs. Now initially I was planning on leaving the springs alone. This spring, which wants to connect right down here at the bottom and stay hooked, would easily come off onto the side, and it would actually rub on the inside of the housing and does not give you a nice trigger feel. So make sure you're checking if your trigger feels a little crunchy. Make sure that this is on properly. But putting the Glock OEM spring, which I have a ton of takeoffs from when I've upgraded springs and whatnot, and I always keep my spare parts just because you never know. I threw in a Glock OEM spring, and it immensely helped the feel of the trigger to the point where I decided to keep it. Plus, your hooks are more closed, so they're less likely to travel and get caught between your housing. You still got to pay attention to it, but that was a nice little upgrade that I wasn't initially planning on doing. So the other thing that I did was I replaced the firing pin safety spring. This is the RXM. I had an extra spring from, it was probably like a Zev competition spring pack, the lighter spring, and I went ahead and replaced that, and that immensely helped the feel of the trigger. The firing pin spring is still the factory spring, so I left that alone. So the last thing I'm going to work on is to see if I can take up a little bit of this pre-travel just to shorten the trigger pull a little bit. Now this first mark, which I'm going to leave this on so we can see before and after, is where the trigger naturally sits. That's where the wall is, and then it's kind of that rolling break. So that's what we have to work with. Now the trigger bar is going to sit just like this inside of the housing. Now what I want to do is to take up some of that pre-travel, is move it back about a 1/16. In order to do that, and this should come with like a big caveat or red flag that if you're unsure or if you don't want to risk ruining anything, you should probably stop here. But if you like to experiment and like taking risks, let's continue on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take up the space by using a 1/16 by 3/16 roll pin, and I am going to drill a hole as close to where this would naturally want to stop as possible and drive it in. So I'm using just a little bit of a hand drill, and I got this off of Amazon. It's a Craft 911 precision pin vise. It comes with some extra little bitty tiny small little drills, and just slowly drive it in nice and straight. Now I went ahead and scored a little bit of a reference line across the side and the top, and just with a little bit of pressure I am just slowly working the drill bit in, trying to keep it perpendicular to everything. Go slow, check your work often. And the question is how deep do you go? Your ejector goes right across the bottom here. You can just go until you feel that. Starting to punch through there. Looks like I'm just going right up against that wall. Okay, so now that I have my hole, I'm going to grab a 1/16 punch. Going to grab my 1/16 by 3/16 roll pin. There we go, just good old-fashioned muscles. Drive that in. And there's the pin. Now, we'll go ahead and assemble it and see what it does to our trigger pull. So as you can see that cruciform is sitting all the way forward. It has about 20% of it sitting on that little ledge in the firing pin housing, in the ejector housing. And that's probably the most aggressive I have gone with one of these setups. So I'm going to be doing some testing just to make sure that it is safe and we don't have any unwanted holes appear in myself or anyone around me. Alright, so what did that do for our trigger? Now, we still have some more work to go, but this is just to show you where it currently is. As you can see, it has almost gone to halfway between where it was and where it starts to hit the wall. So, nice improvement. Now, a couple things we got to check, and resolve. Our trigger safety is no longer functional, so we have to trim that. So that way it becomes functional again. Also, I am looking inside the mag well and seeing how the firing pin safety is, whether it still has free play or if it is already getting trapped underneath that little plunger on the trigger bar. And from what I can tell, looking at it, is as I barely pull the trigger, it is kind of activating it. But I think it's one of those things where it's like right there on the edge. So what do we got to do? So this is our RXM. Here is another trigger bar that I've had to modify a little bit. As you can tell, I've kind of had to shorten this and start the radius a little bit farther down in order to make sure that it clears that safety on the firing pin. So that's the two things that I need to do on the RXM now, is modify that trigger bar and also the trigger shoe safety. So now the trigger safety, I have it removed here, and you'll notice that there's a small little spring on the end. Well, that nib right there is normally what you would cut off to get the clearance, for the trigger safety to be able to hit against the frame. But the spring is right on top of that. So what I'm going to try to do is remove about 2/3 to 3/4 of this bottom part of this trigger safety and see if I can get it to hit the frame. Now if I don't, I either need to call Ruger and beg for another one, or I get an aftermarket shoe. So, yeah. All right, I might have to take some more off, but I still got my nib. Gonna put it back together. All right, so as you can see, I went about halfway on that little nub because I wanted to leave as much material for that spring to sit on. Granted, it's a very light spring, so I didn't have any fear that it would bend under the pressure, but I'd rather play it safe than sorry and come in under the gun and have to add or remove more down the road if I needed to, but looks like half gave the amount of clearance that I need. I just went to where that nub disappears and the thin part of the little trigger safety begins, and that leaves about a 32nd of an inch of room between the safety and the frame. Now as for, here, let's get a flashlight. There we go. So you see that firing pin safety, the trigger bar is just barely on it. So I'm going to go ahead and remove just a little bit just to make sure that it is completely free, and then I should be able to put everything together. I'm not reducing any off the height. I'm just shortening or making that curve just a curve, but this angle just slightly steeper to give it some room. And once I find where it feels really nice, I'll go ahead and give it a nice little polish for its final feel. Alright, so it looks like it just barely starts to touch it as I pull the trigger, but it is fully extended. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and polish that up. Alright, so all put back together, spit and polished. We can see where the trigger now wants to sit, and we still have a safe trigger. I can push on it and it will not go past the frame. Has about a 30 seconds or so of movement before it hits the frame. But more importantly, we can see that the new starting point is about where that little chevron is. So taking up almost a half of that pre-travel, and it should make getting on that trigger and pull so much nicer. So there we are, guys. If you decide to go down this path, do so safely. Make sure you're checking things and feel comfortable with what you're doing. And if not, be prepared to pay for some replacement parts. So thanks for watching. Have a good one.